Given the calculated nature of this crime and your complete disregard for human life, this court sentences you to life in prison.
I'll shoot you.
On June 23, 2020, in Fargo, North Dakota, 16-year-old Kendra Holsinger was shot multiple times in her family's living room by her boyfriend, Randall Turpin, also 16, after she revealed her intention to end their relationship. The gunshots echoed through the quiet neighborhood just after 8:30 p.m., shattering the summer evening stillness in a community where violent crime was rare enough to be shocking. Randall had arrived unannounced at Kendra's house after discovering text messages suggesting she was interested in someone else, his rage building with every passing minute as he confronted her about her perceived betrayal. What began as yet another argument between the teenage couple quickly escalated into the deadliest of outcomes when Randall pulled a handgun from his waistband and fired 4 times at point-blank range. If you're watching this video, please hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. Your engagement helps us bring more cases like Kendra's to light, ensuring these stories are told and remembered. The Holsinger residence, a modest 2-story home with white siding and blue shutters, sat on a corner lot in a middle-class neighborhood where neighbors knew each other by name and children played freely in front yards. Inside that home, while his sister's life was being violently extinguished, 13-year-old Jacob Holsinger huddled in an upstairs closet, clutching his phone, and listening in horror to the argument that had erupted below. He recognized Randall's voice immediately. The distinctive cadence and slight stutter when agitated were unmistakable to Jacob, who had heard his sister's boyfriend countless times over the past year. The boy remained frozen in terror as the shouting grew louder, followed by Kendra's pleading voice, and then the deafening sound of gunshots that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. The small city of Fargo, known for its hard-working residents and tight-knit community values, was utterly unprepared for such a violent tragedy involving 2 local teenagers. The prairie landscape surrounding the city, flat and unforgiving, seemed to mirror the stark reality of what had occurred. There was nowhere to hide from the truth of what had happened in the Holsinger home that night. Parents across the community would later describe hugging their children tighter after news of the murder spread, wondering how such darkness could exist beneath the surface of seemingly normal teenage relationships. This wasn't supposed to happen in Fargo, where neighbors still brought casseroles to welcome newcomers and left their doors unlocked despite the occasional harsh warning from the police department about modern realities. The murder weapon, a .38 caliber revolver that would later be traced to Randall's father's gun collection, was found abandoned in the bushes 3 houses down from the crime scene. Detectives would determine that Randall had taken the weapon from his father's locked gun cabinet using a key he had secretly duplicated months earlier, suggesting a level of premeditation that would become crucial to the prosecution's case. In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, Randall fled on foot through backyard after backyard, eventually making his way home where he showered, changed his clothes, and told his parents he wasn't feeling well and was going to bed early. The gun's recovery would come as a result of a neighbor's security camera that caught a fleeting glimpse of someone matching Randall's description, tossing something into the shrubbery while running from the direction of the Holsinger home. Jacob remained hidden in the closet for nearly 20 minutes after the gunshots before finding the courage to creep downstairs, his body trembling uncontrollably as he called out for his sister. What he discovered in the living room would forever be seared into his memory. Kendra lying motionless on the hardwood floor, blood pooling around her body, her eyes open but vacant. His small hand shook violently as he dialed 911, his voice barely audible through his sobs as he reported that his sister had been shot. The dispatcher kept the terrified boy on the line, instructing him to check if Kendra was breathing or had a pulse, though it was clear from Jacob's description that his sister was beyond help. At just 13 years old, Jacob Holsinger became both witness and first responder to a crime that would irreversibly alter the course of his life and shake the foundations of the community. First responders arrived at the Holsinger residence within minutes, their emergency lights casting eerie red and blue patterns across the faces of neighbors who had emerged from their homes upon hearing the commotion. Paramedics pronounced Kendra dead at the scene, while police officers gently led Jacob to a squad car, wrapping a shock blanket around his shoulders as he struggled to form coherent sentences. The boy's parents, Robert and Deanna Holsinger, had been at a work function across town and arrived home to a scene of unimaginable horror. Their street transformed into a crime scene, their daughter's body being prepared for transport to the medical examiner's office, and their son in a state of traumatic shock. Diana collapsed at the edge of the police tape, her anguished screams cutting through the murmurs of the growing crowd, while Robert stood immobile, his face a mask of disbelief, as officers attempted to explain what little they knew of the situation. As news of the shooting spread through Fargo's social media networks and local news outlets, the community reacted with a mixture of shock, outrage, and profound sadness. Teenagers who knew the couple began posting memories and photos online, many expressing disbelief that Randall could commit such an act, despite some acknowledging his possessive behavior toward Kendra. Parents made frantic calls to ensure their own children were safe at home. The shooting, having shattered their sense of security in a town where the most common crimes were usually minor theft and occasional vandalism. School administrators hastily arranged for crisis counselors to be available the following day, knowing that students would be struggling to process the violent death of their peer and the horrific revelation that the perpetrator was someone they sat beside in class. By midnight, a makeshift memorial of flowers, candles, and teddy bears had begun to form on the sidewalk in front of the Holsinger home, a visual testament to how deeply Kendra's murder had affected the community. Kendra Marie Holsinger was born on September 12, 2003, the first child of Robert and Diana Holsinger, who described her first cry as strong and determined, a characteristic that would define much of her too brief life. She grew up in Fargo, her childhood marked by academic achievement, involvement in community service, and a genuine kindness that teachers and friends consistently mentioned when speaking of her after her death. Her bedroom walls, painted a soft lavender at her request when she turned 13, were covered with honor roll certificates, photographs of friends, and inspirational quotes she had carefully selected and framed. Kendra's parents would later share that. From an early age, their daughter had expressed her desire to become a nurse, specifically working with children, inspired by the compassionate care she had witnessed when her younger brother Jacob was hospitalized with pneumonia as a toddler. At Roosevelt High School, where Kendra had just completed her sophomore year with a 3.9 GPA, she was known for her involvement in the student council, volleyball team, and particularly for founding a mentorship program that paired high school students with elementary school children who needed additional support. Teachers described her as thoughtful and articulate, the kind of student who would stay after class to ask clarifying questions or offer to help classmates who were struggling with the material. Her biology teacher, Mrs. Lawson, fighting back tears at a school memorial service, recalled how Kendra had approached her about organizing a blood drive after learning about shortages at local hospitals, taking on the project with characteristic enthusiasm and attention to detail. The drive had collected 83 units of blood, setting a new record for the school and potentially saving up to 249 lives, a tragic irony considering that medical intervention could not save Kendra's own life when she needed it most. The victim's younger brother, Jacob, despite their 3-year age difference, shared a close bond with his sister, that was evident in the dozens of photographs displayed throughout the Holsinger home. Kendra had been fiercely protective of Jacob, walking him to and from middle school whenever possible, and attending every one of his band concerts, even when they conflicted with her own activities. Friends noted that Kendra's phone lock screen was a photo of herself with Jacob at the state fair, both laughing with cotton candy-stained smiles, their resemblance striking in their shared blue eyes and dimpled grins. Jacob would later tell counselors that Kendra had been his best friend and protector, someone who always made time to help with his homework or listen to his problems, making her absence an unbearable void in his young life. In the months before her death, Kendra had been volunteering every Saturday at Sanford Children's Hospital, reading to young patients and helping with recreational activities designed to make their hospital stays less frightening. The volunteer coordinator described her as a natural healer who could coax smiles from even the most withdrawn children, noting that several parents had specifically requested Kendra's presence during their children's treatments. Her career aspirations had recently crystallized into a specific plan. She hoped to attend North Dakota State University for her nursing degree, then specialize in pediatric oncology, a challenging field that she felt called to after befriending a young leukemia patient during her volunteer work. This dream, like so many others, was permanently extinguished on the night of June 23rd, when the bullets from Randall Turpin's gun tore through her body and stole her future. Kendra's relationship with Randall had begun in September of their sophomore year, when they were paired as lab partners in chemistry class. Initially, friends described the relationship as sweet and mutually supportive, with Randall seemingly in awe of Kendra's intelligence and kindness. Text messages recovered from Kendra's phone showed a relationship that, in its early months, was filled with the typical excitement and affection of first love. Plans for dates, inside jokes, and messages of encouragement before tests or volleyball games. Melissa Davis, Kendra's best friend since elementary school, would later testify that the first few months seemed like something from a teen romance movie, with Randall bringing Kendra flowers for no reason and writing her notes that she would find tucked into her textbooks. The transition from this apparent fairy tale to a relationship characterized by control and fear was gradual enough that many around them failed to recognize the warning signs until it was too late. As winter gave way to spring, subtle changes began to appear in both Kendra's behavior and Randall's attitude toward her. Teachers noticed that the once outgoing girl had become quieter in class, while friends reported that she increasingly declined invitations to social gatherings, especially those where other boys might be present. Melissa observed that Kendra began checking her phone constantly, appearing anxious if she couldn't respond to Randall's messages immediately, and making excuses for his increasingly frequent displays of jealousy. By April, Kendra had stopped volunteering at the hospital on Saturdays, telling the coordinator she needed more time for schoolwork, though Melissa would later reveal that Randall had complained about not seeing her enough on weekends. The vibrant, confident girl who had once organized school events and spoken passionately about her future plans began to dim, her energy increasingly directed toward managing Randall's moods and expectations rather than pursuing her own interests and dreams. In what would later be recognized as a critical moment, Kendra had confided in Melissa just 3 weeks before her murder that Randall had installed a tracking app on her phone, supposedly for her safety, but in reality allowing him to monitor her whereabouts at all times. She described incidents where he would appear unexpectedly at places she was visiting with friends, demanding explanations for why she hadn't told him about her plans or accusing her of lying about who she was with. Melissa had urged her friend to end the relationship, concerned by the escalating controlling behavior, but Kendra had expressed fear about how Randall might react, saying, "You don't understand how angry he gets when I try to set boundaries." This conversation would haunt Melissa in the aftermath of the murder, leaving her wondering if she could have done more to protect her friend from what was clearly becoming a dangerous situation. The final weeks of Kendra's life were marked by increasing distress as she began to plan an exit from the relationship, confiding in both Melissa and her mother that she was afraid of Randall's reaction, but couldn't continue living under his constant surveillance and control. Diana Holsinger had scheduled an appointment with a family therapist for the following week, hoping to get professional guidance on helping her daughter safely end the relationship, unaware that time had already run out. Text messages recovered from Kendra's phone revealed that on the afternoon of June 23rd, she had exchanged messages with a male classmate about a summer reading project, including a light-hearted comment that Randall would later misinterpret as evidence of romantic interest. This innocent exchange became the catalyst for Randall's final fatal visit to the Holsinger home, transforming what might have been merely another painful teenage breakup into a senseless tragedy that robbed a young woman of her future and a community of one of its brightest lights. As news of Kendra's death spread throughout Fargo, the community's response revealed how deeply she had touched the lives of those around her in her 16 years. Hundreds of people attended her candlelight vigil, many sharing stories of small kindnesses Kendra had shown them, from tutoring struggling classmates to standing up for a bullied student in middle school to organizing a surprise birthday party for a friend whose family couldn't afford one. Roosevelt High School's principal described her as the kind of student who made our school a better place just by being part of it, while her volleyball coach recalled how Kendra had insisted on continuing to attend every practice and game even after an injury sidelined her for the season, cheering on her teammates and helping the younger players improve their technique. These tributes painted a portrait of a young woman whose impact had extended far beyond her immediate circle, whose absence would be felt not only by those who loved her, but by all the lives she would have touched and changed in the future that was stolen from her. The 911 call came in at 8:47 p.m., the dispatcher struggling to understand the terrified, sobbing voice of 13-year-old Jacob Holsinger as he tried to explain what had happened in his home. "My sister's been shot," he managed to say between ragged breaths. "I think she's dead. I heard them fighting, and then the gun. Oh, please help her." The dispatcher kept Jacob on the line while simultaneously dispatching patrol units and emergency medical services to the Holsinger residence, gently coaxing additional information from the traumatized boy. When asked if he knew who had shot his sister, Jacob's response was immediate and certain. "It was Randall. I heard his voice when they were arguing. He gets all stuttery when he's mad, and then I heard the shots." This critical piece of information, Jacob's voice identification of the shooter, was relayed to responding officers as they raced toward the scene, lights flashing through the early summer evening in Fargo. First responders arrived at 8:52 p.m., securing the perimeter of the home before entering with weapons drawn, uncertain if the shooter might still be present. Paramedics followed close behind, rushing to Kendra's side, despite the obvious fatal nature of her injuries: 4 gunshot wounds to the chest and abdomen at close range, leaving a gruesome scene that even veteran first responders found disturbing. Officer Marcus Jensen, the first police officer to enter the living room, would later describe the scene as unnervingly quiet, except for the boys sobbing, like all the sound had been sucked out of the room after the violence that had occurred there. Jensen gently led Jacob away from his sister's body, while his partner cleared the rest of the house, confirming that the shooter had fled and taking initial notes about the scene. Signs of a struggle evidenced by overturned furniture, 4 shell casings on the hardwood floor near the victim's body, and no immediately obvious signs of forced entry, suggesting Kendra had likely known her killer. Detective Noah Wilson arrived at the Holsinger home at 9:17 p.m., by which time the scene had been secured, and crime scene technicians were preparing to document and collect evidence. A 15-year veteran of the Fargo Police Department with extensive experience in homicide investigations, Wilson immediately recognized the gravity of the case: a teenage victim, a potential teenage suspect, and a traumatized younger sibling who claimed to have heard the entire incident. His first priority was to speak with Jacob, whose initial identification of Randall Turpin as the shooter needed to be documented while his memory was still fresh, but who was also a child in severe emotional distress requiring careful handling. Wilson found Jacob sitting in the back of an ambulance, a shock blanket wrapped around his shoulders, and a female officer sitting beside him, the boy's parents having just arrived and been informed of their daughter's death, their faces masks of devastation as they tried to comfort their surviving child. With the parents' permission and a child advocate present, Detective Wilson conducted a gentle preliminary interview with Jacob, focusing primarily on what he had heard rather than pressing for details about his sister's body, which the boy had discovered. Jacob's account was surprisingly clear despite his emotional state. He had been upstairs playing video games with headphones on when he heard raised voices downstairs, removing his headphones to realize his sister was arguing with someone. "I knew right away it was Randall," Jacob stated, his voice small but certain. "He has this way of talking when he's angry. Like his words get all jumbled and he kind of stutters, and he was yelling at Kendra about some guy named Tyler." The boy described hearing Kendra telling Randall to leave, saying they needed to talk another time when you're not like this, followed by what sounded like a scuffle, Kendra yelling, "Put that away!" and then 4 distinct gunshots. Detective Wilson noted both the clarity of Jacob's recollection and the consistency with which he identified Randall Turpin's voice, considering this voice identification to be a crucial piece of evidence given the apparent lack of eyewitnesses to the actual shooting. While Detective Wilson was interviewing Jacob, crime scene technicians methodically documented the Holsinger living room, photographing Kendra's body from multiple angles before the medical examiner authorized its removal to the county morgue for autopsy. Lead crime scene technician Sarah Lundgren supervised the collection of evidence: 4 .38 caliber shell casings, blood samples, fibers from the couch and carpet, and potential touch DNA from surfaces the shooter might have contacted. Of particular interest was Kendra's phone, found on the coffee table with the screen shattered, suggesting it might have been thrown or struck during the argument. Lundgren secured the device for digital forensic examination, anticipating that it might contain vital evidence about Kendra's relationship with Randall and any communications that preceded the shooting. The technicians also noted what appeared to be defensive wounds on Kendra's hands and forearms, suggesting she had tried to protect herself from the attack, a detail that would later become important in refuting claims that the shooting had been accidental. As the initial investigation at the crime scene progressed, additional officers were dispatched to locate Randall Turpin, treating him as a person of interest based on Jacob's identification. At 10:22 p.m., officers arrived at the Turpin residence, a split-level home approximately 2 miles from the Holsinger house, where they found Randall in his bedroom, claiming to have been home all evening due to not feeling well. His parents, Michael and Elizabeth Turpin, appeared genuinely shocked by the officers' questions, insisting there must be some mistake, as their son was incapable of violence and had been home since dinner time. Detective Wilson, who arrived shortly after the patrol officers, noted that Randall seemed unusually calm given the situation. His clothes appeared freshly changed, and his hair was damp as though recently showered, inconsistent with his claim of having been in bed for hours. When asked directly about Kendra Holsinger, Randall acknowledged being her boyfriend, but claimed he hadn't seen her since school let out for summer 2 weeks prior, a statement that would later be proven false through digital evidence and witness accounts. While Randall was being questioned at his home, other investigators began canvassing the Holsingers' neighborhood, seeking witnesses who might have seen someone entering or leaving the residence around the time of the shooting. This canvass yielded a critical break in the case when retired schoolteacher Margaret Olson, who lived 3 doors down from the Holsingers, reported that her home security camera might have captured someone running through her front yard shortly after she heard what she had assumed were fireworks, but now understood were gunshots. Officers immediately secured Mrs. Olson's permission to access the footage, which clearly showed a young male matching Randall's description sprinting across her lawn at 8:45 p.m., appearing to throw something into the hedge bordering her property before continuing out of frame. This information prompted a search of the hedgerow, where officers discovered a .38 caliber revolver partially concealed among the branches, its serial number matching a weapon registered to Michael Turpin, Randall's father. The recovery of the murder weapon dramatically altered the tenor of the investigation, providing physical evidence that corroborated Jacob's voice identification and contradicted Randall's alibi. Detective Wilson, now joined by his partner Detective Rebecca Chen, returned to the Turpin residence with a search warrant, taking Randall into custody as a suspect in Kendra's murder, while additional officers began a thorough search of his bedroom, vehicle, and personal effects. The search yielded several items of evidentiary value: a hidden key that matched the lock on Michael Turpin's gun cabinet, clothes with microscopic blood spatter concealed at the bottom of Randall's hamper, and a journal that contained disturbing entries about Kendra's perceived betrayal and punishment. Most damning was Randall's phone, which revealed he had been tracking Kendra's location through a shared app, had exchanged angry text messages with her earlier that day accusing her of cheating, and had searched online for how to tell if girlfriend is lying about other guys, just hours before the murder. As dawn broke over Fargo on June 24th, the initial phase of the investigation had yielded substantial evidence pointing to Randall Turpin as Kendra's killer. The medical examiner's preliminary report confirmed what was already apparent. Kendra had died from multiple gunshot wounds to the chest and abdomen, with stippling around the wounds indicating she had been shot at very close range. Digital forensics technicians began the process of recovering data from both Kendra's and Randall's phones, while crime lab personnel expedited analysis of the recovered firearm for fingerprints, DNA, and ballistic comparison to the bullets recovered during Kendra's autopsy. Detective Wilson, preparing for a more formal interrogation of Randall, reviewed the evidence collected thus far. Jacob's voice identification placing Randall at the scene, security footage showing someone matching his description, fleeing the area, the recovery of the murder weapon, linked to his father, physical evidence from his home, and digital evidence suggesting a motive rooted in jealousy and perceived betrayal. The foundation of the case was rapidly taking shape around what appeared to be a tragic but increasingly common scenario, a controlling relationship that had escalated to lethal violence when the victim attempted to assert her independence. Detective Noah Wilson sat at his desk in the Fargo Police Department's Criminal Investigation Division, reviewing his notes from Jacob Holsinger's initial statement, while crime scene photos from the Holsinger residence were being uploaded to the department's secure server. The boy's voice identification of Randall Turpin was compelling, not merely a vague suggestion that it might have been Randall, but a specific and confident identification based on distinctive speech patterns Jacob had heard many times before. Wilson, who had worked dozens of homicide cases during his career, knew that ear witness testimony, while less common than eyewitness accounts, could be equally valuable, particularly when the witness was familiar with the subject's voice and could identify specific characteristics like Randall's tendency to stutter when agitated. The detective made notes to arrange for a more detailed recorded statement from Jacob once the boy had been given time to process the initial trauma, knowing that this voice identification would likely be central to the prosecution's case if charges were filed against Randall Turpin, While physical evidence was still being processed, Wilson and his partner, Detective Rebecca Chen, began building a profile of Randall Turpin, focusing on his relationship with Kendra and any history that might suggest a capacity for violence. Their first interviews with Randall's teachers and coaches painted a picture of an academically average student who excelled in baseball and was generally well-liked, if somewhat reserved, showing no obvious red flags that would suggest violent tendencies. Mr. Peters, Randall's American history teacher, described him as quiet but engaged and respectful to authority figures, noting that he seemed particularly protective of Kendra when they were together at school. Coach Daniels, who had worked with Randall on the junior varsity baseball team, characterized him as competitive and intense during games, but never one to lose his temper or fight with umpires or opposing players. These initial character assessments seemed at odds with the emerging evidence suggesting Randall had murdered his girlfriend in a jealous rage, prompting the detectives to dig deeper into the dynamics of his relationship with Kendra. The investigation took a significant turn when Melissa Davis, Kendra's best friend, came forward voluntarily to speak with detectives, having learned of Kendra's murder through social media and immediate suspecting Randall's involvement. In a recorded interview at the police station with her parents present due to her being a minor, Melissa provided critical context about the relationship that had not been apparent to teachers or coaches. She described witnessing a gradual but alarming transformation in Randall's behavior toward Kendra over the 8 months they had been dating, beginning with what seemed like sweet attentiveness, but evolving into constant texting, showing up unexpectedly when Kendra was out with friends, and becoming visibly agitated if she didn't respond to his messages promptly. It got to the point where Kendra would panic if her phone battery was low because she knew Randall would freak out if she didn't answer right away, Melissa explained, her voice breaking. He started accusing her of cheating if she took too long to respond, even when she was at volleyball practice or helping her mom with Jacob. Melissa's testimony led detectives to interview other friends in Kendra and Randall's social circle, uncovering a pattern of concerning behavior that had largely gone unnoticed by adults, but had been increasingly apparent to peers. Tyler Johnston, the classmate with whom Kendra had been texting about a summer reading project on the day of her murder, revealed that Randall had confronted him aggressively at a party 2 weeks earlier, accusing him of trying to steal my girlfriend, simply because Tyler and Kendra had been assigned to the same project group. Ashley Weber, another friend, described an incident at a school dance where Randall had grabbed Kendra's arm hard enough to leave bruises after seeing her talking to a male cousin who was visiting from out of town. These accounts, combined with Melissa's testimony about the tracking app on Kendra's phone, began to form a disturbing picture of controlling behavior that had escalated over time and could potentially have culminated in violence when Randall believed his control was being threatened. As detectives continued interviewing Kendra and Randall's peers, digital forensic specialists began analyzing data recovered from both teenagers' phones, providing a detailed timeline of their communications in the hours leading up to the murder. The exchanges revealed a rapid escalation in Randall's tone throughout the day of June 23rd, beginning with typical morning texts but growing increasingly accusatory after he saw that Kendra had exchanged several messages with Tyler Johnston. By mid-afternoon, Randall was sending messages demanding to know what's going on with you and Tyler, accusing Kendra of making a fool of me and insisting they needed to talk face-to-face tonight. Kendra's responses showed her attempting to de-escalate, explaining that the texts were about a school assignment and suggesting they discuss things when you're calmer. The final message from Randall, sent at 8:15 p.m., simply stated, "I'm coming over now." Location data from Randall's phone confirmed that he had left his house shortly after sending this message, traveled directly to the Holsinger residence, and then moved rapidly away from the area at approximately 8:45 p.m., aligning perfectly with the timeline established by Jacob's 911 call and the security camera footage from Mrs. Olson's home. While digital evidence was strengthening the case against Randall, forensic analysts at the North Dakota State Crime Lab were processing the physical evidence collected from both the crime scene and the Turpin residence. Preliminary ballistics testing confirmed that the .38 caliber revolver found in the hedge near the Holsinger home was indeed the murder weapon, with rifling patterns on test-fired bullets matching those recovered from Kendra's body. Fingerprint analysis revealed Randall's prints on the gun's handle, trigger, and cylinder, while DNA testing of blood spatter found on the clothing hidden in his hamper confirmed it was Kendra's blood. Michael Turpin, upon being questioned about the weapon, confirmed it was his, and stated that he kept it locked in a cabinet for home protection, expressing shock and dismay upon learning that his son apparently had access to the gun. Further investigation revealed that the duplicate key found in Randall's room had been made approximately 3 months earlier at a local hardware store, suggesting the theft of the weapon was not an impulsive act, but had involved planning and forethought. By the end of the second day of investigation, Detective Wilson had compiled enough evidence to justify charging Randall Turpin with first-degree murder, presenting his findings to District Attorney Catherine Brennan in a preliminary case briefing. The evidence connecting Randall to the crime was substantial and multifaceted. Jacob Holsinger's voice identification, placing him at the scene, security camera footage showing someone matching his description fleeing the area, the recovery of the murder weapon with his fingerprints and DNA, incriminating digital communications and location data from his phone, physical evidence including the victim's blood on his clothing, and testimony from multiple witnesses regarding his controlling and jealous behavior toward Kendra. Brennan agreed that the evidence was compelling, particularly the aspect of premeditation suggested by Randall's possession of a duplicate key to his father's gun cabinet, and authorized Wilson to proceed with formal charges, noting that despite Randall's age, the severity of the crime and the evidence of planning justified trying him as an adult under North Dakota law. The formal charging of Randall Turpin as an adult in the murder of Kendra Holsinger sent shockwaves through the Fargo community, particularly among students and parents at Roosevelt High School. Media coverage of the case was extensive, with local news outlets publishing yearbook photos of both teenagers side by side, Kendra smiling brightly in her volleyball uniform, Randall looking somewhat more serious in his baseball team photo. The narrative that emerged in early reporting focused heavily on the apparent motive of jealousy and control, with headlines like "Teen Killed for Texting Classmate" and "Digital Tracking Led to Real-World Violence," framing the story in terms that resonated with growing concerns about technology, privacy, and teenage relationships. School administrators held an emergency meeting with parents to address fears and questions, bringing in counselors to help students process the traumatic event and encouraging them to speak up if they observed concerning behaviors in their own relationships or those of their friends. As Randall remained in juvenile detention, awaiting his first court appearance, detectives continued building their case, focusing particularly on establishing the timeline of events leading up to the murder. They interviewed Kendra's parents about any changes they had observed in their daughter's behavior or in her relationship with Randall, learning that Diana Holsinger had indeed begun to have concerns about Randall's possessiveness, but hadn't realized the full extent of his controlling behavior. Kendra had started making excuses not to see him as often, Diana explained through tears. And just a few days ago, she told me she wanted to break up with him, but was afraid of how he'd react. Robert Holsinger, still reeling from his daughter's death, recalled an incident the previous month when Randall had appeared unexpectedly at their home looking for Kendra, who was at a study group, describing how the boy had seemed unusually agitated and had questioned Robert repeatedly about exactly where she was and who she was with. These parental observations added another layer to the emerging pattern of escalating control and surveillance that appeared to have culminated in violence when Randall believed he was losing his grip on the relationship. Over the following week, prosecutors and investigators worked to strengthen the case against Randall Turpin, delving deeper into the digital evidence that would prove crucial in establishing both opportunity and motive. Fargo Police Department's digital forensics specialist, technician James Kovach, meticulously documented the contents of both Kendra's and Randall's phones, creating a comprehensive timeline of their communications and activities in the months leading up to the murder. Kovach's analysis revealed that Randall had installed a location-sharing app on Kendra's phone in March, ostensibly as a safety measure, but configured to provide him with constant updates about her whereabouts without requiring her to actively check in. The app's history showed that Randall had checked Kendra's location an average of 22 times daily in the final month of her life, with frequency increasing to as many as 40 checks on days when she participated in activities without him. The obsessive monitoring pattern supported the prosecution's theory that Randall's need for control had intensified as the relationship progressed, creating a volatile situation that exploded into violence when he perceived a threat to that control. Further examination of Randall's online activities uncovered searches that painted a disturbing picture of his mindset in the weeks before the murder. His browser history included queries like how to tell if your girlfriend is cheating, tracking someone without them knowing, and most alarmingly, what happens to minors who commit serious crimes. Detective Wilson found this last search particularly telling, as it suggested Randall had contemplated the potential consequences of violence and had researched the legal ramifications for someone his age. The search had been conducted 3 weeks before Kendra's murder, challenging any narrative of the shooting as a momentary loss of control, and instead suggesting a period of contemplation and information gathering before the act. Prosecutor Madison Stewart, reviewing this evidence, noted that these searches would be powerful in demonstrating premeditation and undermining any defense claims that the killing was an impulsive act committed in the heat of passion. As digital evidence continued to accumulate, Detective Wilson conducted follow-up interviews with Melissa Davis, focusing specifically on what Kendra had shared about Randall's behavior in the final weeks of her life. Melissa revealed that approximately 3 weeks before the murder, Kendra had confided that she was planning to end the relationship after discovering Randall had been accessing her social media accounts without permission. She showed me how he had been logging into her Instagram and reading her direct messages, even responding to some guys pretending to be her and telling them to leave her alone, Melissa explained, visibly distressed at the memory. Kendra was really scared. When she found out, she said it felt like he was taking over her identity. Melissa also described how Kendra had begun changing passwords and reducing what she shared online, actions that appeared to have increased Randall's paranoia and accusations of secrecy, creating a cycle of escalating tension that culminated in the confrontation on June 23rd. The breakthrough that firmly established Randall's motive came from Kendra's diary, which her parents found in her desk drawer and provided to investigators. The journal entries from the final month painted a clear picture of a young woman increasingly frightened by her boyfriend's behavior and determined to end the relationship. In an entry dated just 1 week before her death, Kendra had written, "I told Melissa today that I'm going to break up with Randall after finals. I can't keep living like this, jumping every time my phone buzzes, explaining every conversation I have with anyone else. I think I might be interested in Tyler, but I'm too afraid to even talk to him normally because of how R would react. Mom says we'll talk to that counselor next week about the best way to end things safely. I just hope R doesn't go crazy when I tell him it's over." This entry provided direct evidence of Kendra's intention to leave the relationship, the very motive prosecutors believed had driven Randall to murder, and mentioned her interest in Tyler Johnston, the classmate whose texts had apparently triggered Randall's final rage. As the case against Randall solidified around his controlling behavior and Kendra's plans to end the relationship, investigators also focused on reconstructing the events of June 23rd in minute detail. Cell tower data and GPS information from Randall's phone confirmed he had left his home at 8:17 p.m., minutes after sending his final text to Kendra stating he was coming over. Surveillance footage from a gas station halfway between the two houses captured Randall walking briskly toward the Holsinger residence at 8:24 p.m., his expression tense and his right hand suspiciously close to his waistband, where the gun was likely concealed. Additional footage from a neighbor's doorbell camera recorded the sound of raised voices coming from the Holsinger home beginning at approximately 8:35 p.m., followed by 4 distinct gunshots at 8:42 p.m. This timeline, combined with Mrs. Olson's security camera capturing Randall fleeing the scene at 8:45 p.m. and Jacob's 911 call at 8:47 p.m., created a precise chronology that left no doubt about Randall's presence at the exact time of the murder. The forensic evidence supporting the case continued to strengthen as laboratory analyses were completed. The autopsy report confirmed that Kendra had died from 4 gunshot wounds to the chest and abdomen fired from a distance of less than 3 feet, with gunpowder residue patterns indicating the shooter had stood directly in front of her. Defensive wounds on her arms suggested she had raised them in an attempt to protect herself, contradicting any potential claim that the shooting had been accidental. DNA analysis confirmed that blood found on Randall's sneakers, which had been hidden in his closet beneath other shoes, was Kendra's, while gunshot residue was detected on the sleeve of the shirt he had apparently been wearing during the shooting and then concealed in his hamper. The recovered .38 caliber revolver, conclusively identified as the murder weapon through ballistics comparison, bore only Randall's fingerprints on the grip and trigger, with a partial palm print from his father on the barrel, consistent with Michael Turpin's statement that he periodically cleaned the weapon but hadn't handled it recently. 2 weeks after the murder, Detective Wilson received permission from the district attorney's office to offer a plea deal to Randall Turpin, hoping to spare the Holsinger family, particularly Jacob, the trauma of a trial. The offer would allow Randall to plead guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for a recommended sentence of 25 years to life, with the possibility of parole after serving the minimum term. Wilson and prosecutor Madison Stewart presented the offer to Randall's defense attorney, Gerald Hoffman, during a meeting at the juvenile detention facility where Randall was being held. Hoffman, after consulting privately with his client, returned with Randall's response, a flat rejection of the plea offer and insistence on taking the case to trial, claiming the shooting had been an accident that happened during an argument and that he had never meant to hurt Kendra. This decision meant that Jacob would indeed need to testify about what he had heard that night, and the full details of Randall's controlling behavior and Kendra's fear would be exposed in open court. With trial now inevitable, the prosecution team focused on preparing their witnesses, particularly Jacob Holsinger, whose testimony about recognizing Randall's voice during the argument preceding the gunshots would be crucial to placing the defendant at the scene. Child psychologist Dr. Eleanor Prentice was brought in to work with Jacob, helping him process his trauma while also preparing him for the experience of testifying in court. Dr. Prentice reported that despite his young age and the horrific circumstances, Jacob remained consistent and clear in his recollection of hearing Randall's distinctive speech pattern during the argument with Kendra, noting that the boy's certainty about the voice identification appeared genuine and uncoached. Prosecutor Stewart also worked closely with Melissa Davis, ensuring she was prepared to testify about Kendra's increasing fear of Randall and her plans to end the relationship, knowing that establishing this motive would be essential to securing a first-degree murder conviction rather than the lesser charge of second-degree murder that the defense would likely seek. As the case progressed toward trial, the broader implications of Kendra's murder began to reverberate through the Fargo community and beyond. Local schools implemented educational programs about healthy relationships and the warning signs of dating violence, while parents organized discussion groups focused on monitoring their teenagers' digital activities without invading their privacy. A social media campaign titled Kendra's Legacy gained traction nationally, encouraging young people to speak up if they witnessed controlling behavior in relationships and providing resources for those who felt trapped in similar situations. The Holsinger family, though still deep in grief, expressed hope that their daughter's tragedy might prevent other families from experiencing similar losses, establishing a scholarship fund in Kendra's name for students pursuing careers in counseling or victim advocacy. Meanwhile, as summer turned to fall in Fargo, the judicial process continued its methodical pace, with Randall Turpin's trial scheduled to begin in November, a proceeding that would not only determine his fate, but also provide a public reckoning with the dangers of obsessive control and possessive love that had ended a promising young life. The formal arrest of Randall Turpin for the first-degree murder of Kendra Holsinger took place at 6 a.m. on June 25th, 2 days after the shooting. Detective Noah Wilson led a team of officers to the Turpin residence, where they found Randall asleep in his bedroom, the reality of his situation not yet having fully registered, despite his earlier questioning and the preliminary evidence collection at his home. Officers secured the house and woke Randall, informing him he was under arrest, while Detective Wilson read him his Miranda rights in the presence of his parents, who appeared shell-shocked as they watched their son being handcuffed. Michael Turpin, Randall's father, attempted to intervene, insisting there must be some mistake, while Elizabeth Turpin collapsed into tears, repeating, "He's just a boy," as officers escorted Randall to a waiting police vehicle. Randall himself remained eerily calm during the arrest, his expression blank and his responses monosyllabic, a demeanor that Detective Wilson noted in his report as potentially indicative of shock, calculation, or emotional detachment. The stark reality of the Fargo Police Department's booking procedures, fingerprinting, mugshot photography, and placement in a holding cell seemed to finally penetrate Randall's composure, with officers noting he began to tremble visibly as the gravity of his situation became apparent. Juvenile detention officers observed him alternating between periods of complete stillness and bursts of agitation, at one point punching the wall of his cell hard enough to bruise his knuckles. When informed that his parents had contacted attorney Gerald Hoffman to represent him, Randall reportedly nodded without speaking, maintaining the same unsettling calm that had characterized much of his behavior since the murder. This pattern of emotional regulation, or perhaps suppression, continued as he was transported to the juvenile detention wing of the Cass County Jail, where he would be held until the court decided whether he would be tried as an adult, a determination that seemed increasingly likely given the severity of the crime and the mounting evidence of premeditation. The formal interrogation of Randall Turpin began at 2:30 p.m. that same day, conducted by Detectives Wilson and Chen in a small, windowless room at the Cass County Jail, with Attorney Hoffman present to represent his client's interests. The session was recorded on video, capturing not only the questions and answers, but also the subtle shifts in Randall's demeanor as the interrogation progressed. Initially, he maintained the same story he had offered during preliminary questioning. He hadn't seen Kendra on the day of the murder, had been home ill since the afternoon, and had no knowledge of what had happened at the Holsinger residence. Wilson noted that Randall delivered this account without the stuttering that Jacob had identified as characteristic of his speech when agitated, his voice steady and his gaze direct, suggesting he had rehearsed the narrative and was making a conscious effort to appear composed and truthful. When Hoffman occasionally whispered advice to remain silent on certain questions, Randall would nod slightly but otherwise showed little acknowledgement of his attorney's presence. His attention fixed almost exclusively on the detectives across the table. The tenor of the interrogation shifted dramatically when Detective Wilson laid out a series of photographs on the table. The recovered .38 caliber revolver, the security camera image showing someone matching Randall's description fleeing the scene, and the blood-spattered clothing found in his hamper. "We know you were there, Randall," Wilson said calmly, maintaining eye contact with the teenager. "We have your father's gun with your fingerprints on it. We have you on camera, running from the Holsinger house right after the shooting. We have Kendra's blood on your clothes." The effect of these statements on Randall was immediate and visible. His controlled facade cracked, his breathing quickened, and the stutter that Jacob had described emerged as he attempted to respond. I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he stammered, ignoring Attorney Hoffman's hand on his arm, cautioning him to remain silent. "It was an accident. The gun just went off. I loved her." This partial confession marked a turning point in the interrogation, with Randall abandoning his earlier denial of being present at the crime scene, but shifting to a narrative of accidental discharge rather than intentional shooting. Detective Chen, who had remained quietly observant until this point, gently pressed for details, asking Randall to explain why he had brought a loaded gun to his girlfriend's house if he had no intention of using it. Randall's response revealed glimpses of the possessive mindset that investigators believed had motivated the crime. "I just wanted to scare her, to make her listen to me. She was texting that guy Tyler all the time, and I knew something was going on." When Chen asked directly if Randall had been tracking Kendra's location and monitoring her communications, his response was telling in its lack of recognition that such behavior was problematic. "Of course I was. She was my girlfriend. I had a right to know where she was and who she was talking to." This statement, delivered without stutter or hesitation, suggested a deeply entrenched belief in his right to control Kendra's actions and relationships, providing valuable insight into the mindset that had preceded the violence. Despite Attorney Hoffman's increasingly urgent signals for his client to stop talking, Randall continued to provide damaging details about the events leading up to the shooting, though his account often contradicted the physical evidence and other witness statements. He claimed to have brought the gun just to talk seriously with Kendra, insisted that he had only fired once rather than the 4 times confirmed by ballistics and Jacob's account, and maintained that the shooting occurred when Kendra tried to grab the gun from him during their argument. Detective Wilson, recognizing the significance of these admissions despite their self-serving distortions, allowed Randall to continue his narrative while occasionally interjecting with specific questions about key details: his acquisition of the duplicate key to his father's gun cabinet, which Randall claimed was for emergencies; his knowledge of when Kendra would be home alone with just her brother present, information he had gleaned from the tracking app, and his decision to flee the scene rather than calling for help after what he claimed was an accidental shooting, which he attributed to panic and confusion. 3 hours into the interrogation, Detective Wilson directly confronted Randall with Jacob Holsinger's statement about hearing the argument and recognizing Randall's distinctive voice, including the boy's specific recollection of hearing Kendra say, "Put that away," before the gunshots. This revelation visibly shook Randall, who had apparently been unaware that anyone else was home during the confrontation with Kendra. "Jacob was there?" he asked, genuine surprise evident in his voice. "He heard everything?" When Wilson confirmed that Jacob had indeed heard the argument and the subsequent gunshots, and had immediately identified Randall as the shooter based on his voice, the teenager's composure completely collapsed. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders heaving with what appeared to be sobs, though Detective Chen noted in her report that no actual tears were observed. After several minutes of this display, Randall looked up and made a statement that investigators would later identify as one of the most revealing of his true mindset. She was going to leave me for him, for Tyler, after everything I did for her, everything I gave up. She was just going to walk away like I meant nothing. At this point, Attorney Hoffman forcefully intervened, requesting a private consultation with his client, and then informing the detectives upon their return that Randall would not be answering any further questions. The formal interrogation was terminated at 6:15 p.m., having yielded significant admissions. Randall had placed himself at the scene, acknowledged bringing the gun, and effectively confirmed the motive of jealousy and fear of losing control of the relationship. While he had attempted to characterize the shooting as accidental, his statements about wanting to make her listen and his evident anger about her perceived betrayal supported the prosecution's theory of intentional homicide motivated by possessive rage. Furthermore, his surprise at learning Jacob had been in the house contradicted his claim of accidental discharge, as it suggested he had been so focused on confronting Kendra that he had failed to consider the possibility of witnesses and oversight inconsistent with his otherwise calculated approach to the situation, as evidenced by his acquisition of the gun and knowledge of when Kendra would be vulnerable. Following the interrogation, Randall was returned to his cell in the juvenile detention wing, where staff reported he became increasingly agitated as the evening progressed, eventually requiring observation for self-harm concerns after he was found banging his head against the wall of his cell. Mental health professionals were called in to evaluate him, diagnosing acute stress reaction and recommending close monitoring, though they found no evidence of psychosis or other conditions that might significantly impact his legal competence. Meanwhile, Detectives Wilson and Chen prepared their report on the interrogation, highlighting the key admissions and inconsistencies in Randall's account, particularly his acknowledgement of bringing the gun to scare Kendra and his revelation about his belief that she was planning to leave him for Tyler, the precise motive that prosecutors had theorized based on other evidence in the case. The following morning, prosecutors filed a motion to try Randall Turpin as an adult, citing the premeditated nature of the crime as evidenced by his acquisition of the duplicate key to the gun cabinet, his use of tracking technology to monitor Kendra's movements, and his decision to bring a loaded weapon to confront her about her perceived infidelity. The motion also emphasized the brutality of the crime, 4 shots fired at close range, and Randall's actions following the murder, including his attempts to hide evidence and construct a false alibi as indicative of a level of calculation inconsistent with the juvenile justice system's rehabilitative focus. Judge Samuel Ellsworth scheduled a hearing on the motion for the following week, but given the severity of the charges and the strength of the evidence, legal observers predicted that Randall would almost certainly be transferred to adult court, where he would face the possibility of life imprisonment rather than the more limited sentences available in the juvenile system. As news of Randall's partial confession spread through official channels, the Holsinger family received an update from Prosecutor Madison Stewart, who met with them at their home to explain the latest developments in the case. The confirmation that Kendra had been killed because she wanted to end her relationship with Randall brought a new wave of grief mixed with anger, particularly for her father, Robert, who expressed regret that he hadn't recognized the warning signs of Randall's controlling behavior sooner. Jacob, still traumatized but finding strength in his role as a key witness, asked detailed questions about whether his testimony about recognizing Randall's voice would be enough to put him away for good, revealing the beginning of a shift from shock to a desire for justice. Diana Holsinger, clutching her daughter's senior portrait, simply whispered. She was trying to get away from him. She was doing the right thing, and he killed her for it. This sentiment, that Kendra had died for attempting to assert her independence from a controlling relationship, would become central to the narrative that emerged as the case progressed toward trial, a narrative that would ultimately transform a personal tragedy into a powerful cautionary tale about the deadly potential of possessive love. The Cass County Courthouse in downtown Fargo stood as an imposing neoclassical structure of red brick and limestone, its formal grandeur a stark contrast to the teenage tragedy that would unfold within its walls. On the morning of November 15, 2020, nearly 5 months after Kendra Holsinger's murder, the building was surrounded by news vans and reporters, their presence transforming what would normally be a quiet Monday morning into a media spectacle. Inside Courtroom 3A, bailiffs conducted extra security sweeps, aware of the high-profile nature of the case and the intense emotions it had generated throughout the community. The courtroom itself reflected the solemn traditions of American justice: polished wooden benches, the state seal mounted prominently behind the judge's bench, the jury box empty but prepared for the 12 citizens who would ultimately decide Randall Turpin's fate. The sterile formality of the setting seemed to minimize the human drama at its center, a 16-year-old boy facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison, and a family grieving the senseless loss of their daughter and sister. Judge Samuel Ellsworth had granted the prosecution's motion to try Randall as an adult following a hearing in July, where the defense's arguments about Randall's youth and potential for rehabilitation had failed to overcome the evidence of premeditation and the brutality of the crime. The decision meant that Randall now faced charges of first-degree murder, which in North Dakota carried a potential sentence of life imprisonment, though his age would make him eligible for parole consideration after serving 30 years. Throughout the pre-trial proceedings, Randall had maintained the demeanor that Detective Wilson had noted during his interrogation, an unsettling calm punctuated by moments of visible agitation, particularly when Kendra's name was mentioned, or when Jacob Holsinger's voice identification was discussed. His parents, Michael and Elizabeth Turpin, had attended every hearing, their expressions reflecting a mixture of disbelief, grief, and desperate hope that somehow their son would be spared the harshest consequences of his actions, despite the mounting evidence against him. At precisely 9:20 a.m., the courtroom doors opened to admit the public, creating a clear division as people filed in. On the right side, supporters of the Holsinger family, many wearing small purple ribbons signifying domestic violence awareness. On the left, a smaller group of Turpin family friends and relatives, their expressions guarded as they navigated the hostile glances from across the aisle. Robert and Diana Holsinger entered accompanied by victim advocates, their faces showing the strain of months of grief compounded by the stress of the approaching trial. Jacob, who would be a key witness, was not present for the opening day, his parents having decided to shield him from as much of the proceedings as possible until his testimony was required. The Turpins entered separately, Elizabeth clutching a small Bible, Michael's hand supportive at her back, as they made their way to seats directly behind the defense table where their son would soon be brought in from holding. The entrance of Randall Turpin created a palpable shift in the courtroom's atmosphere, a collective intake of breath, as the teenager shuffled in wearing a navy blue suit that seemed slightly too large, making him appear younger and more vulnerable than in his mugshot photos that had been circulated in the media. Gone was the athletic high school baseball player, replaced by a paler, thinner version who had spent the past months in detention. His hands were uncuffed for court appearances, a concession to his age and the desire to avoid prejudicing the jury. But the presence of 2 deputies flanking him as he walked to the defense table made his status as a prisoner unmistakable. Randall briefly made eye contact with his parents, offering a small nod, before taking his seat beside Attorney Gerald Hoffman, who leaned in to whisper last-minute instructions or reassurances. Across the courtroom, Diana Holsinger turned away, unable to look at the boy who had taken her daughter's life, while Robert stared directly at Randall, his gaze unflinching and full of barely contained anger. Prosecutor Madison Stewart arrived with purpose, her stride confident as she arranged materials at the prosecution table, occasionally conferring with Detective Wilson, who would be a key witness in establishing the timeline of the investigation. At 36, Stewart had built a reputation as a methodical and effective prosecutor, particularly skilled at presenting complex evidence in ways that juries could easily understand. This case, while emotionally charged, was legally straightforward in many ways. The evidence connecting Randall to the crime was substantial, and the challenge would be establishing the element of premeditation necessary for a first-degree murder conviction rather than the second-degree charge that the defense would likely argue for. Stewart had prepared meticulously, anticipating the defense's strategies and ready to counter them with the compelling narrative of a controlling relationship that had ended in violence when the victim attempted to assert her independence. Judge Ellsworth entered the courtroom at 9:15 a.m., his presence commanding immediate silence, as the bailiff called, "All rise." The judge, known for running a strict but fair courtroom, took his seat and began with preliminary matters, addressing procedural issues and establishing expectations for the conduct of all parties during what was anticipated to be a 2-week trial. He acknowledged the emotional nature of the case, but emphasized that the proceedings would be governed by rules of evidence and legal principles rather than sentiment, a pointed reminder intended for both the gallery and the attorneys. Following these preliminaries, the judge ordered the jury pool to be brought in for the selection process, a task that would occupy the remainder of the day as the prosecution and defense worked to identify 12 jurors and 2 alternates who could approach the case with objectivity despite its high profile in the community and the youth of both the victim and the defendant. The following morning, with the jury selected and sworn in, a diverse group of 7 women and 5 men ranging in age from 24 to 67, opening statements began, providing the first opportunity for each side to present their narrative of the events of June 23, 2020. Prosecutor Stewart approached the jury with measured steps, making eye contact with each member before beginning her statement. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and steady, "this case is about control, obsession, and what happens when a young woman tries to break free from both." She proceeded to outline the prosecution's case, how Randall had monitored Kendra's movements and communications, how he had secured a key to his father's gun cabinet months before the murder, and how, when confronted with the possibility of Kendra leaving him for another boy, he had made the deliberate decision to take her life rather than accept her choice. Stewart emphasized Jacob's voice identification, the recovery of the murder, weapon with Randall's fingerprints, and the digital evidence that established a clear timeline and motive, concluding with a powerful statement. "The evidence will show that Randall Turpin did not kill Kendra Holsinger in a momentary passion, but as the final ultimate act of control over a young woman who simply wanted the freedom to make her own choices." Defense attorney Gerald Hoffman presented a markedly different narrative in his opening statement, portraying Randall as a troubled but not malevolent teenager whose emotions had overwhelmed his judgment. "This is a tragedy, not a cold-blooded murder," Hoffman told the jury, his tone somber but emphatic. "What you will hear is the story of a 16-year-old boy who brought a gun to frighten, not to kill, and who found himself in a situation that spiraled out of his control." Hoffman challenged the prosecution's characterization of premeditation, suggesting instead that Randall had acted impulsively after an emotional confrontation, and raised questions about the reliability of Jacob's voice identification given the boy's traumatized state. He concluded by asking the jury to consider not only what had happened that terrible night, but also Randall's age and capacity for understanding the full consequences of his actions, implying without explicitly stating that a conviction for a lesser charge than first-degree murder would be appropriate given these factors. Following opening statements, Prosecutor Stewart called her first witness, medical examiner Dr. Victor Chang, who had performed Kendra's autopsy. Using clinical language that nonetheless conveyed the brutality of the crime, Dr. Chang testified about the 4 gunshot wounds that had ended Kendra's life, describing their trajectories and the damage they had caused to vital organs. When questioned about the position of the shooter relative to the victim, Dr. Chang indicated that based on the bullet paths and gunpowder residue patterns, the shots had been fired from a distance of approximately 2 to 3 feet, with the shooter directly facing Kendra. This testimony contradicted Randall's claim during interrogation that the gun had discharged during a struggle, as the consistent distance and positioning of the wounds suggested the shooter had maintained control of the weapon throughout the incident. Dr. Chang also confirmed the presence of defensive wounds on Kendra's forearms, indicating she had raised her arms in an instinctive attempt to protect herself, further undermining any suggestion that the shooting had been accidental. The prosecution's second witness was Officer Marcus Jensen, who had been first to arrive at the crime scene following Jacob's 911 call. Jensen described finding the traumatized 13-year-old kneeling beside his sister's body, too shocked to speak coherently, and his initial observations of the scene, the overturned furniture suggesting a struggle, the 4 shell casings on the floor near Kendra's body, and the absence of any signs of forced entry. His testimony established the baseline facts of the crime scene before the arrival of detectives and crime scene technicians, painting a vivid picture for the jury of the immediate aftermath of the shooting. When defense attorney Hoffman cross-examined Jensen about whether the scene could be consistent with a struggle over the gun, the officer firmly stated that the physical evidence, particularly the positioning of the shell casings, indicated the shots had been fired from a consistent position rather than during a physical altercation over the weapon. As the first day of testimony concluded, Prosecutor Stewart informed the court that the following day would begin with Jacob Holsinger's testimony, requesting special accommodations given his age and the traumatic nature of his experience. Judge Ellsworth granted permission for a comfort dog to be present with Jacob during his testimony and for breaks as needed, acknowledging the difficulty of what would be asked of the young witness. The judge then addressed the jury, reminding them to avoid media coverage of the trial and to refrain from discussing the case with anyone before adjourning for the day. As the courtroom emptied, the weight of what was to come hung in the air. The testimony of a 13-year-old boy who had hidden in fear while his sister was murdered, whose voice identification of Randall Turpin was a cornerstone of the prosecution's case, and whose trauma was a stark reminder of the ripple effects of one violent act that had forever changed multiple lives in the quiet community of Fargo. The courtroom fell silent as Jacob Holsinger was escorted to the witness stand, a therapy dog named Beacon walking steadily beside him, the animal's presence noticeably calming the 13-year-old's trembling hands. Dressed in a blue button-down shirt and khaki pants, Jacob appeared both younger than his years and somehow aged beyond them, the contradictory effects of trauma visible in his thin frame and the shadows beneath his eyes. Diana Holsinger watched her son with a mixture of pride and anguish, knowing that his testimony would force him to relive the most horrific moments of his young life, but also recognizing his determination to speak for the sister who could no longer speak for herself. Across the courtroom, Randall Turpin kept his gaze downward, avoiding eye contact with the younger boy, as defense attorney Gerald Hoffman whispered urgently in his ear, likely cautioning him about his demeanor during this critical testimony. Prosecutor Madison Stewart approached Jacob with gentle respect, beginning with simple questions about his relationship with Kendra to help him adjust to the courtroom environment before gradually transitioning to the events of June 23, 2020. Jacob's voice, initially barely audible, grew stronger as he spoke about his sister, describing her as my best friend, and the person who always stood up for me. When asked about the day of the murder, Jacob explained that he had been playing video games in his room with headphones on when he first became aware of raised voices downstairs. I took my headphones off because I heard someone yelling, he testified, his hand resting on Beacon's head for comfort. I recognized Randall's voice right away. He has this specific way of talking when he gets mad, like his words get stuck, and he stutters a lot. Jacob went on to explain that he had heard this distinctive speech pattern many times before when Randall would become agitated during visits to their home, making the voice immediately identifiable to him, despite not being able to see who was in the living room with his sister. Stewart guided Jacob through a careful recounting of what he had heard, with the boy testifying that he had become frightened by the intensity of the argument and had hidden in his closet while continuing to listen. Kendra was telling him to calm down, that they could talk about whatever was bothering him another time, Jacob recalled. His composure remarkable, despite the difficult subject matter. But Randall kept getting louder, accusing her of cheating on him with someone named Tyler. Jacob testified that he heard his sister deny the accusations, followed by what sounded like furniture being moved or knocked over, then Kendra's voice clearly saying, "Put that away," in a tone he described as really scared. This critical piece of testimony directly corroborated the prosecution's theory that Randall had deliberately brought the gun to frighten Kendra, contradicting the defense's suggestion that the weapon had been introduced spontaneously or without clear intent to threaten. When asked about what happened next, Jacob's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down his face as he described hearing 4 distinct gunshots in rapid succession, followed by complete silence. "I was so scared I couldn't move for a long time," he testified, his voice breaking. "I thought maybe he was still down there and would come looking for me next." Jacob described how he had eventually found the courage to leave his hiding place and creep downstairs, calling his sister's name and receiving no response. The courtroom remained utterly silent as he recounted finding Kendra's body and making the 911 call, many jurors visibly moved by the boy's account of trauma that no child should have to experience. Throughout this testimony, Randall maintained his downward gaze, his jaw clenched and a muscle visibly twitching in his cheek, while his mother, Elizabeth, silently wept in the gallery behind him. Defense attorney Hoffman's cross-examination of Jacob was measured and careful, clearly mindful of how the jury might perceive aggressive questioning of a traumatized child. Rather than directly challenging Jacob's identification of Randall's voice, Hoffman focused on establishing the limitations of what the boy had actually witnessed. "You never actually saw Randall in your house that night, did you, Jacob?" Hoffman asked gently. Jacob acknowledged that he had not seen Randall, only heard his voice. Hoffman then questioned whether Jacob could be certain about the number of gunshots he had heard, given his frightened state and distance from the living room, suggesting that the trauma of the situation might have affected his perception. Jacob remained firm. "I heard 4 shots. I counted them because I was so scared." When Hoffman attempted to suggest that what Jacob had heard might have been consistent with a struggle over the gun rather than deliberate shots, Jacob's response was simple but devastating. Kendra said, "Put that away," and then there were gunshots. There wasn't a lot of noise like people fighting over something. Following Jacob's testimony, Prosecutor Stewart called Melissa Davis, Kendra's best friend, to the stand. 17 years old and visibly nervous, Melissa nevertheless spoke with clarity and conviction about the changes she had observed in Kendra's relationship with Randall over the months preceding the murder. At first, it seemed like a normal high school relationship, she testified. Randall was really attentive, always texting her, walking her to classes. But then it started to feel excessive. Melissa described how Randall had begun tracking Kendra's location through a shared app, supposedly for safety reasons, and would question her friend intensely if she went anywhere unexpected or failed to respond to his texts promptly. She recounted specific incidents that had concerned her, including an occasion when Randall had appeared unexpectedly at a girls' shopping trip after Kendra's phone battery had died, having tracked her last known location to the mall, and then searched store by store until he found her. Most critically, Melissa testified about a conversation she had with Kendra just 3 weeks before the murder, in which her friend had confided her plans to end the relationship with Randall. She was really scared about how he would react, Melissa told the court, her voice steady despite the emotion evident in her expression. She showed me how he'd been logging into her social media accounts without her permission, reading her messages, even pretending to be her, sometimes to tell guys to stay away from her. According to Melissa, Kendra had specifically mentioned her growing friendship with classmate Tyler Johnston as something that made her particularly fearful of Randall's reaction, saying, "He would lose his mind if he knew I was even thinking about being with someone else after we break up." This testimony directly established the motive that the prosecution had outlined in their opening statement: Randall's fear of losing control over Kendra and his rage at the prospect of her leaving him for another boy. On cross-examination, defense attorney Hoffman attempted to characterize Randall's behavior as typical teenage jealousy rather than dangerous control, suggesting that Melissa might be interpreting normal relationship insecurities through the lens of what ultimately happened. Melissa's response was measured but firm. There's jealousy, and then there's tracking someone's every move and password, hacking their accounts. That's not normal. When Hoffman questioned whether Melissa had ever witnessed Randall being physically violent toward Kendra, she acknowledged she had not seen him hit her, but described an incident at a party where he had gripped Kendra's arm so tightly while pulling her away from a conversation with male classmates that it had left finger-shaped bruises. This testimony potentially undermined the defense's portrayal of Randall as a non-violent teenager who had acted completely out of character on the night of the murder. The prosecution's case gained further strength with the testimony of Tyler Johnston, the classmate whose text exchanges with Kendra on the day of the murder had apparently triggered Randall's final confrontation with her. Tyler, a tall, somewhat awkward 17-year-old, testified about the summer reading project he and Kendra had been assigned to work on together, describing their text messages as purely academic in nature, though acknowledging they had developed a friendship that might have eventually become something more had circumstances been different. He recounted an incident 2 weeks before the murder when Randall had confronted him aggressively at a party, accusing him of trying to steal Kendra and warning him to back off or regret it. Tyler testified that he had been sufficiently concerned by the encounter to mention it to his parents, who had advised him to keep his distance from the situation, advice he had followed, except for the project-related texts that he and Kendra had exchanged on June 23rd. Digital forensics specialist James Kovach provided some of the most damning evidence against Randall, testifying about the contents of both teenagers' phones and the digital trail that established both motive and premeditation. Kovach walked the jury through the tracking app Randall had installed on Kendra's phone, demonstrating how it had been configured to provide constant updates about her location without requiring her active participation. He presented data showing that Randall had checked Kendra's whereabouts 37 times on the day of the murder alone, with frequency increasing after he had seen her text exchanges with Tyler. Kovach also presented Randall's search history from the weeks before the murder, including queries about what happens to minors who commit serious crimes, and signs your girlfriend is cheating, which the prosecution argued demonstrated both his growing suspicion of Kendra and contemplation of violence with awareness of potential consequences. Perhaps the most powerful testimony came from forensic psychologist Dr. Elaine Harriman, who specialized in adolescent relationship violence and had reviewed the evidence in the case. Without personally evaluating Randall, Dr. Harriman explained to the jury the concept of coercive control, describing it as a pattern of behavior that seeks to take away the victim's liberty or freedom, to strip away their sense of self. She identified multiple elements of Randall's behavior that fit this pattern: the location tracking, monitoring of communications, isolation from friends, unexpected appearances to check on Kendra's activities, and emotional manipulation through accusations and jealousy. Dr. Harriman testified that when such controlling relationships are threatened by the victim's attempts to leave, the risk of violence increases dramatically. What we often see in these cases is the mentality of, "If I can't have you, no one can," she explained. The ultimate act of control becomes taking the person's life rather than accepting their decision to leave the relationship. Defense attorney Hoffman vigorously cross-examined Dr. Harriman, challenging her conclusions given that she had never met or evaluated Randall personally, and suggesting that she was pathologizing normal teenage relationship insecurities. Dr. Harriman held firm, distinguishing between typical jealousy and Randall's systematic monitoring and control of Kendra's activities. Jealousy is an emotion that most people experience, she testified. What we're discussing here is a pattern of behavior that goes well beyond emotion into a system of surveillance and control. When Hoffman suggested that Randall's age made him less culpable for failing to manage his emotions appropriately, Dr. Harriman acknowledged that adolescent brains are still developing impulse control, but noted the evidence in this case, the acquisition of the gun well before the murder, the ongoing monitoring, the stated concerns about consequences for serious crimes, suggests planning and awareness rather than purely impulsive action. The prosecution's final witness was Detective Noah Wilson, who provided comprehensive testimony about the investigation from the initial crime scene to Randall's eventual arrest and interrogation. Wilson methodically walked the jury through each piece of physical evidence: the recovery of the murder weapon with Randall's fingerprints, the shell casings at the scene that matched the .38 caliber revolver, the blood-stained clothing hidden in Randall's hamper, and the duplicate key to Michael Turpin's gun cabinet found in Randall's possession. He detailed the timeline established through cell phone data and surveillance footage, demonstrating that Randall had traveled directly from his home to the Holsinger residence immediately after sending his final text to Kendra, remained there during the time when gunshots were heard by neighbors, and then fled the scene, discarding the weapon along the way before returning home to shower and change his clothes in an apparent attempt to destroy evidence. Most damaging to the defense was Wilson's account of Randall's interrogation, during which he had initially denied being at the Holsinger home, but eventually admitted his presence when confronted with the evidence. Wilson testified about Randall's statements regarding his motive, his belief that Kendra was planning to leave him for Tyler, and his admission that he had brought the gun to make her listen and scare her. The detective emphasized Randall's reaction upon learning that Jacob had been in the house and had identified his voice. Genuine surprise followed by the revealing statement. "She was going to leave me for him. After everything I did for her, she was just going to walk away like I meant nothing." This testimony directly supported the prosecution's argument that Randall had acted out of a possessive desire to control Kendra rather than in a momentary passion, seeing her as something that belonged to him rather than as an autonomous person with the right to make her own choices. As the prosecution rested its case, the collective evidence presented to the jury painted a disturbing picture. a controlling relationship that had escalated to lethal violence when the victim attempted to assert her independence, a jealous boyfriend who had monitored his girlfriend's every move and eventually taken her life rather than accept her choice to leave him, and a community forever changed by a tragedy that might have been prevented had the warning signs of dangerous control been recognized sooner. The defense would now face the challenge of countering this narrative, but the powerful testimony presented, from Jacob's clear voice identification to Melissa's account of Kendra's growing fear to the damning digital evidence of surveillance and premeditation, had created a compelling case that would be difficult to overcome. As Judge Ellsworth adjourned court for the day, the weight of evidence against Randall Turpin hung heavy in the air, leaving many to wonder not if he would be convicted, but only of which degree of murder the jury would ultimately find him guilty. After 7 days of testimony and evidence presentation, the defense case had done little to shake the prosecution's narrative. Randall Turpin had taken the stand in his own defense, against the apparent advice of his attorney, insisting that he had brought the gun only to get Kendra to take me seriously, and that the shooting had been accidental during a struggle. His testimony, however, was undermined by frequent contradictions of the physical evidence and his own prior statements, as well as a damaging moment during cross-examination when Prosecutor Madison Stewart asked about his reaction to discovering Kendra's text messages with Tyler Johnston. "She was mine," Randall had stated emphatically, his composure cracking momentarily. "She didn't have the right to just throw away everything we had." This possessive language, coupled with his admission that he had brought the gun to frighten Kendra, had visibly affected several jurors, their expressions reflecting the chilling implication that Randall viewed his girlfriend as a possession rather than a person with autonomy. On November 24, 2020, after 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned to Courtroom 3A to deliver their verdict in the case of State of North Dakota v. Randall Turpin. The courtroom was filled to capacity, with extra bailiffs positioned strategically to maintain order regardless of the outcome. The Holsinger family sat together in the front row behind the prosecution table, Robert's arm protectively around Diana's shoulders, Jacob between them, looking both younger and older than his 13 years in a formal suit that seemed to emphasize his thin frame. Across the aisle, Elizabeth and Michael Turpin clutched each other's hands, their faces drawn with the strain of waiting to learn their son's fate. Randall himself sat at the defense table beside Attorney Hoffman, his expression unnervingly blank. The same controlled demeanor he had maintained throughout much of the trial, except for rare moments when his composure had slipped to reveal glimpses of the anger that the prosecution argued had driven him to murder. Judge Samuel Ellsworth called the court to order precisely at 2 p.m., his stern expression revealing nothing about his expectations for the verdict as he asked the jury foreperson if they had reached a decision. "We have, Your Honor," responded juror number 4, a middle-aged high school teacher who had been selected as foreperson. The courtroom fell utterly silent as the clerk took the verdict form and passed it to Judge Ellsworth, who reviewed it briefly before returning it for the formal reading. In the case of State of North Dakota versus Randall Michael Turpin on the charge of murder in the first degree, we, the jury, find the defendant. The foreperson's voice rang out clear and unwavering. "Guilty!" A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by a sob from Elizabeth Turpin, while Diana Holsinger covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with emotion, as Robert embraced her tightly. Randall's reaction to the verdict was initially minimal, a slight stiffening of his shoulders, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw. But as Judge Ellsworth thanked the jury for their service and announced that sentencing would be scheduled for December 15th, the reality seemed to finally penetrate the teenager's carefully maintained composure. His breathing became visibly rapid and shallow, his hands gripping the edge of the defense table until his knuckles whitened, his gaze darting between his parents and the judge as though searching for some sign that this outcome could still be reversed. Attorney Hoffman leaned in to whisper something that appeared intended to be calming, but Randall shook his head sharply, his control visibly fraying as the judge began to address procedural matters regarding the pre-sentencing investigation. Behind him, Elizabeth Turpin wept openly, her husband's face a mask of stunned disbelief as the full weight of their son's conviction for first-degree murder and the severe sentence that would likely follow began to register. The 3 weeks between the verdict and sentencing were filled with procedural preparations and heightened emotions on all sides. The pre-sentencing investigation included interviews with both Randall and his parents, evaluations by mental health professionals, and impact statements from Kendra's family and friends describing how her murder had affected their lives. Local media coverage remained intense, with opinion pieces debating whether a life sentence for a 16-year-old, regardless of the severity of his crime, constituted justice or excessive punishment. Advocacy groups for domestic violence prevention pointed to the case as evidence of the need for greater education about the warning signs of controlling relationships, while others argued that Randall's age and the possibility of rehabilitation should be given greater weight in sentencing considerations. Through it all, the families at the center of the tragedy remained largely private in their grief and anxiety, preparing for the final courtroom confrontation that would determine the practical consequences of the jury's verdict. On the morning of December 15th, Courtroom 3A was once again filled to capacity for Randall Turpin's sentencing hearing. The Holsinger family had arrived early, accompanied by additional relatives and friends who had traveled to Fargo to support them through what they hoped would be the conclusion of the legal process, if not of their grief. Deanna Holsinger clutched a framed photograph of Kendra in her volleyball uniform, a visual reminder of the vibrant young woman whose future had been stolen, while Jacob sat between his parents, his expression solemn but composed, as he prepared to face once more the person who had killed his sister. The Turpins entered minutes later, Elizabeth noticeably thinner than at the beginning of the trial, Michael guiding her gently to their seats, both parents clearly bracing themselves for the likelihood that their son would receive a sentence that might keep him imprisoned for the remainder of their lifetimes. Randall was brought in from Holding, now wearing standard-issue jail attire, rather than the suits he had worn during the trial, the change in appearance emphasizing his transition from accused to convicted. Though still technically a juvenile at 16, his conviction as an adult had resulted in his transfer from juvenile detention to a segregated section of the county jail reserved for younger offenders awaiting sentencing or transfer to state facilities. The physical toll of this transition was evident in his appearance, the shadows under his eyes, the pallor of his skin, the slight tremor in his hands as he took his seat beside Attorney Hoffman. Gone was the controlled demeanor that had characterized much of his courtroom presence during the trial, replaced by a nervous vigilance that suggested he was only now fully comprehending the reality of his situation and the severity of the consequences he faced. Judge Ellsworth began the proceedings by inviting victim impact statements, and Robert Holsinger was the first to approach the podium, a written statement in his hand, though he rarely referred to it as he spoke. "My daughter Kendra was 16 years old," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his expression. "She will never graduate from high school, never go to college, never become the pediatric nurse she dreamed of being. She will never fall in love with someone who truly respects her, never get married, never have children of her own." Robert spoke of the void Kendra's death had left in their family, describing how her bedroom remained untouched, how he still sometimes called her name before remembering she was gone, how Jacob had been struggling with survivor's guilt and nightmares since witnessing the aftermath of his sister's murder. He concluded by looking directly at Randall, You didn't just take Kendra's life that night, you took part of all of us. And for what? Because she wanted to make her own choices? Because she wanted to be free? Diana Holsinger followed her husband, her statement more directly addressing Randall as she held up the photograph of Kendra. "I want you to look at her," Diana said, her voice breaking. "Really look at the person you killed, not as something that belonged to you, but as the beautiful, kind, amazing young woman she was." Diana spoke about Kendra's volunteer work with sick children, her academic achievements, and her plans for the future, painting a vivid picture of all that had been lost. She described the day they had received the call about Kendra's death as the daytime stopped for our family, explaining how ordinary activities like grocery shopping or watching television now felt hollow and surreal in a world without their daughter. Unlike her husband, Diana did not directly address what she hoped Randall's sentence would be, stating only, "No punishment can bring Kendra back to us, but perhaps it can prevent someone else from making the choice you made, from believing they have the right to control another person's life or take it if they can't." Most powerful was Jacob's statement, delivered in a clear voice that occasionally wavered but never broke, as he described not only losing his sister, but also the trauma of finding her body and the continuing nightmares that followed. "I used to think monsters weren't real," the 13-year-old stated, looking directly at Randall for the first time since his testimony. "Now I know they don't look like monsters. They look like normal people who think they own other people." Jacob described how he had struggled with guilt over hiding in his closet rather than trying to help Kendra, despite being repeatedly told by counselors and family that he had done the right thing and would likely have been killed himself had he intervened. "I want you to go to prison for the rest of your life," he concluded, his directness startling in one so young, not just because of what you did to Kendra, but because of what you might do to someone else if you ever get out. People who think they own other people don't change. Following the impact statements, defense attorney Hoffman presented arguments for leniency in sentencing, emphasizing Randall's age, lack of prior criminal history, and potential for rehabilitation given appropriate intervention and therapy. He referenced brain development research suggesting adolescents have diminished capacity for impulse control and full appreciation of consequences, arguing that a 16-year-old, regardless of the severity of their crime, should not be sentenced as though they have the fully developed moral reasoning of an adult. Hoffman requested a sentence that would include the possibility of parole after 25 years, the minimum allowed under North Dakota law for a juvenile convicted of first-degree murder as an adult, suggesting this would balance the need for punishment with recognition of Randall's youth and capacity for change. He also presented letters from teachers, coaches, and family friends attesting to Randall's previously good character and expressing shock at his actions, portraying the murder as an aberration rather than a reflection of his true nature. Prosecutor Madison Stewart countered with arguments for the maximum sentence allowable, focusing on the premeditated nature of the crime, the evidence of ongoing controlling behavior that had preceded it, and the devastating impact on the Holsinger family and the broader community. This was not an impulsive act by an otherwise good kid who made one terrible mistake, Stewart argued. This was the culmination of months of escalating control, surveillance, and possessiveness, ending in a deliberate decision to take a young woman's life rather than accept her right to end a relationship. Stewart emphasized that while Randall's age was a mitigating factor that had already been accounted for in his eligibility for parole consideration, something not available to adults convicted of the same crime, the severity of his actions and the clear evidence of planning warranted the most serious consequences available under the law. She concluded by reminding the court that Kendra had been the same age as Randall, yet her youth had not protected her from his decision to end her life, stating she deserved the chance to grow up, to learn, to change, to become whoever she might have been. Randall Turpin made the choice to take that chance from her forever. Judge Ellsworth then asked Randall if he wished to make a statement before sentencing, a standard opportunity for defendants to express remorse or offer context that might influence the court's decision. After a brief whispered consultation with his attorney, Randall rose unsteadily to his feet, his voice initially so quiet that the judge had to ask him to speak up. "I'm sorry for what happened to Kendra," he began, his words carefully chosen and his tone flat rather than emotional. "I never meant for things to end this way. We loved each other, and things just got out of control that night." As he continued, his statement focused more on his own suffering and future than on Kendra or her family. "I'm only 16. I don't deserve to spend my whole life in prison for one mistake. Everyone deserves a second chance." The lack of genuine remorse was palpable, as was his continued framing of the murder as an accident or mistake, rather than a deliberate act for which he bore full responsibility, an approach that visibly affected Judge Ellsworth, whose expression grew increasingly stern as Randall spoke. After all statements were complete, Judge Ellsworth delivered his sentencing decision, beginning with an acknowledgment of the tragedy that had befallen both families, but quickly transitioning to a sharp assessment of Randall's actions and apparent lack of genuine remorse. "Mr. Turpin, you stand before this court having been convicted of the first-degree murder of Kendra Holsinger, a young woman whose only crime was wishing to end a relationship with someone who viewed her not as an equal partner, but as a possession to be controlled," the judge stated. "The evidence presented at trial established beyond any doubt that your actions were not impulsive, but calculated, from obtaining the key to your father's gun cabinet, to installing tracking software on Ms. Holsinger's phone, to bringing a loaded weapon to confront her when you believed she might be interested in someone else." Judge Ellsworth specifically referenced Randall's own statement moments earlier, noting that his characterization of the murder as a mistake and his focus on his own future rather than the life he had taken reflected a continuing failure to accept full responsibility for his actions or to comprehend the depth of harm he had caused. With a solemnity that hushed the courtroom, Judge Ellsworth pronounced the sentence: life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 30 years, the maximum allowed under North Dakota law for a juvenile convicted of first-degree murder as an adult. "This sentence reflects the severity of your crime, the clear evidence of premeditation, and the need to protect society from someone who has demonstrated both the willingness and capacity to take a human life when denied what they believe they are entitled to," the judge explained. "While your age has been considered as a mitigating factor in maintaining the possibility of parole, albeit at the upper end of the range allowed by law, I am not convinced that you currently possess the moral compass or empathy necessary to safely return to society. Whether that changes over the next 3 decades will be for a future parole board to determine," the judge concluded by addressing both families directly, acknowledging that no sentence could heal the wounds that had been inflicted or bring Kendra back to her loved ones, but expressing hope that the conclusion of the legal process might allow some measure of closure and the beginning of a long healing process. The courtroom remained silent for several seconds after Judge Ellsworth finished speaking, the finality of the sentence settling over those present before the stillness was shattered by Randall's sudden, explosive reaction. "This is bullshit," he shouted, lunging to his feet with such force that his chair toppled backward. 30 years? I'll be older than my parents." As bailiffs moved quickly toward him, Randall's gaze fixed on Judge Ellsworth, his face contorted with rage, as the careful composure he had maintained throughout much of the proceedings completely collapsed. "I'll shoot you," he screamed, the words echoing through the stunned courtroom as bailiffs grabbed his arms. "When I get out, I'll find you." Behind him, Elizabeth Turpin's anguished wail cut through the chaos. "Not my boy. He didn't mean it," as her husband tried unsuccessfully to reach for their son through the barrier of court officers now surrounding him. The outburst confirmed for many what the prosecution had argued throughout the trial, that beneath Randall's controlled exterior lay a volatile anger and sense of entitlement that had driven him to murder Kendra when she threatened to leave him, and that now erupted when another authority figure imposed consequences he found unacceptable. Judge Ellsworth, remarkably composed, despite having just been directly threatened, ordered the courtroom cleared as additional officers rushed in to help restrain Randall, who continued to shout threats and obscenities as he was forcibly removed to a holding cell. The Holsinger family was quickly escorted out through a side door while the Turpins remained frozen in their seats, Michael trying to comfort his hysterical wife as the reality of their son's actions and future sank in with devastating clarity. Outside the courthouse, a crowd of reporters and community members had gathered, awaiting news of the sentencing. When word of both the life sentence and Randall's violent reaction spread, reactions were mixed but predominantly supportive of the judge's decision. Parents of teenagers who had known Kendra expressed relief that Randall would remain incarcerated through their own children's high school and college years, while domestic violence advocates pointed to his courtroom threat as vindication of their warnings about the dangerous progression from controlling behavior to violence. Some community members, particularly those with connections to the Turpin family, expressed sadness for parents who had lost their son to the prison system just as surely as the Holsingers had lost their daughter to violence, reflecting the ripple effects of tragedy that extended far beyond the immediate families involved. As twilight settled over Fargo on that December evening, the community began the process of absorbing the conclusion of a legal case that had held the city's attention for nearly 6 months. The courthouse steps, where protesters had sometimes gathered during the trial with signs demanding either mercy or maximum punishment for Randall, were now quiet, save for a small memorial of flowers and candles that had appeared in Kendra's memory. Local news crews packed away their equipment after delivering their final reports on the sentencing and the dramatic courtroom threat that had followed, while at the Holsinger home, extended family gathered to support Robert, Diana, and Jacob as they began navigating a world in which justice had been served, but their daughter and sister remained irretrievably lost. Across town, the Turpin house sat dark and empty, its occupants having chosen to stay with relatives rather than face the media likely waiting at their door, their family forever altered by their son's actions and the consequences that would shape the remainder of all their lives. In the days following Randall Turpin's sentencing, the additional charges stemming from his courtroom threat against Judge Ellsworth were processed with swift efficiency. The Cass County Prosecutor's Office filed charges of threatening a judicial officer, a Class C felony in North Dakota, with Prosecutor Madison Stewart recommending that any sentence run consecutive to rather than concurrent with Randall's existing life sentence. Defense attorney Gerald Hoffman, recognizing the futility of fighting these new charges given the dozens of witnesses to Randall's outburst, negotiated a plea agreement that added 5 years to Randall's sentence before parole eligibility, extending the minimum time from 30 to 35 years. Judge Ellsworth, demonstrating remarkable professionalism, recused himself from these proceedings, despite being the target of the threats, allowing Judge Patricia Morton to handle the plea and sentencing. Randall, now seemingly comprehending the self-defeating nature of his outburst, remained subdued throughout this secondary legal process, offering no statements and showing none of the volatility that had characterized his reaction to the original sentence. By early January 2021, Randall had been transferred from county jail to the North Dakota State Penitentiary's Juvenile Wing, a specialized unit for offenders under 18 who had been convicted as adults. His intake assessment indicated significant risk factors for both depression and violence, resulting in placement on suicide watch during his initial adjustment period, and mandatory participation in anger management and cognitive behavioral therapy programs. Reports from correctional staff described him as withdrawn and occasionally hostile, struggling to adapt to the structured environment and restrictions of prison life. Elizabeth and Michael Turpin visited weekly during this transitional period, their interactions with their son observed as tense and emotionally charged, with Elizabeth often leaving in tears while Michael attempted to counsel Randall on accepting his situation and focusing on personal development despite his circumstances. The reality of decades of imprisonment before even the possibility of parole seemed to settle gradually over the teenager, manifesting in alternating periods of rage and despair that prison psychologists noted were not unusual for young offenders facing extended sentences. For the Holsinger family, the conclusion of the legal proceedings brought neither closure nor relief, but rather a shift in the nature of their grief, from the acute crisis of the murder and trial to the chronic pain of learning to live without Kendra. Diana Holsinger returned to her job as an elementary school librarian in February, describing the routine as both anchor and torment, necessary structure that helped her function day to day, but also a constant reminder of the normal life that had been shattered by her daughter's murder. Robert, whose work as an architectural engineer had been on indefinite hold since Kendra's death, found himself unable to return to his previous position, the precision and focus required now beyond his emotional capacity. Instead, he channeled his professional skills into volunteering with Habitat for Humanity, finding that physical labor alongside others working toward a positive goal provided both distraction from his grief and a sense of creating something meaningful in a world that often seemed senseless since losing his daughter. Jacob Holsinger's recovery proved to be both the family's greatest challenge and, ultimately, their most powerful motivation to find a path forward. The 13-year-old, traumatized not only by his sister's murder, but by discovering her body and then having to testify about the experience, initially struggled with severe post-traumatic stress symptoms, including nightmares, hypervigilance, and emotional withdrawal. Traditional therapy helped to some degree, but it was his involvement with a peer support group for siblings of homicide victims that seemed to provide the most significant benefit, connecting him with others who understood his specific form of grief and trauma. By the summer of 2021, Jacob had begun speaking to small groups about his experience, his natural resilience gradually reasserting itself as he found meaning in using his story to help others recognize the warning signs of controlling relationships before they escalated to violence. His parents, witnessing their son's slow healing and determination to create something positive from tragedy, found in his example the strength to move beyond mere survival toward rebuilding their lives in a way that honored Kendra's memory. On the first anniversary of Kendra's death, June 23, 2021, the Holsinger family announced the establishment of the Kendra Holsinger Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to educating young people about healthy relationships and the warning signs of dating violence. With initial funding from a community fundraiser that had exceeded all expectations, raising over $175,000 in donations ranging from a few dollars to several substantial anonymous contributions, the foundation partnered with local schools to develop age-appropriate curriculum materials about consent, respect, and recognizing controlling behaviors. Diana, who had taken a leave of absence from her library position to serve as the foundation's executive director, worked closely with domestic violence experts to ensure their educational materials were evidence-based while remaining accessible and engaging for teenage audiences. The Foundation's first major initiative, a series of workshops titled Recognize, Respond, Reach Out, was piloted in Fargo area high schools during the 2021-2022 academic year, with plans to expand to middle schools and eventually to develop resources for parents and educators throughout North Dakota and beyond. Roosevelt High School, where both Kendra and Randall had been students, underwent its own reckoning with the tragedy that had unfolded among its student body. Principal Margaret Lawson, who had been devastated by the failure to recognize the warning signs in Randall and Kendra's relationship, instituted mandatory training for all staff on identifying concerning behaviors in teenage relationships and developed clear reporting protocols for situations that might indicate abuse or control. The school counseling department expanded its resources on healthy relationships and created confidential channels for students to express concerns about their own relationships or those of friends without fear of judgment or immediate intervention that might escalate volatile situations. A memorial garden was established in a courtyard near the science wing, where Kendra had excelled in her biology and chemistry classes, featuring a bench inscribed with her favorite quote, "Be the light that helps others see." The space quickly became a quiet refuge for students seeking reflection or peace during difficult days, a tangible reminder of both the tragedy that had occurred and the community's commitment to preventing similar losses in the future. The broader Fargo community's response to Kendra's murder evolved over time from shocked disbelief to determined action aimed at preventing similar tragedies. Local women's shelters and domestic violence organizations reported significant increases in both donations and volunteers in the year following the murder, with many citing the case as their motivation for becoming involved. The Fargo Police Department partnered with these organizations to enhance officer training on responding to relationship violence, particularly among teenagers who might not fit traditional domestic violence profiles. Detective Noah Wilson, whose investigation had built the case against Randall, became a frequent speaker at community events, sharing insights from the case while respecting the family's privacy, his presentations focusing on the digital dimension of controlling relationships and how technology that could be used for stalking and surveillance might be detected by parents, friends, or the victims themselves before control escalated to violence. For Melissa Davis, Kendra's best friend who had recognized the warning signs but been unable to prevent the tragedy, the aftermath brought both lasting grief and a powerful sense of purpose. After graduating from Roosevelt High School in 2021, she enrolled at North Dakota State University to study social work, inspired by her experiences to pursue a career helping adolescents navigate difficult relationships and situations. Melissa became a key volunteer with the Kendra Holsinger Foundation, bringing her unique perspective as someone who had witnessed her friend's relationship deteriorate from seemingly normal teenage romance to dangerous control. Her presentations to high school students were particularly effective, as she could speak authentically about the subtle ways controlling behavior often masquerades as care or concern, and how difficult it can be to recognize when a relationship is becoming unhealthy when you're in the middle of it. "I missed some of the signs with Kendra, or didn't take them seriously enough," she would tell students. "I'm sharing her story so you don't miss them with your friends or in your own relationships." The Turpin family's experience in the aftermath of their son's conviction and imprisonment was markedly different from the Holsingers, characterized by social isolation and the complex grief of having a child who was still living but effectively lost to them for decades to come. Michael and Elizabeth initially remained in Fargo, determined to be close enough for regular prison visits and to demonstrate their continued support for Randall despite his actions. However, the strain of living in a community where their family name had become synonymous with a horrific crime eventually proved too great to bear. In August 2021, they sold their home and relocated to a small town in South Dakota, seeking anonymity and a fresh start, while still remaining within reasonable distance for monthly visits to the penitentiary. Their marriage, tested by the stress of their son's crime, and its aftermath, survived but was fundamentally altered, their shared grief and guilt creating a bond that was both supportive and isolating, keeping them together while simultaneously distancing them from the wider world that could not comprehend their particular form of loss and shame. The legal consequences of Randall's courtroom threat extended beyond the additional 5 years added to his sentence, potentially affecting his future parole prospects in ways that would not become apparent for decades. Legal experts noted that parole boards typically consider both the nature of the original crime and the inmate's behavior and evidence of rehabilitation while incarcerated, with violent outbursts or threats likely to be viewed as indicators that an offender remains dangerous. Prosecutor Madison Stewart asked about this impact in a media interview conducted on the first anniversary of the sentencing, stated, "Mr. Turpin's reaction to his sentence demonstrated precisely why the judge's decision was appropriate. When faced with consequences he didn't like, his immediate response was to threaten violence, the same pattern that led to Kendra Holsinger's murder." This assessment was shared by many in the legal community who viewed the courtroom outburst as validation of concerns about Randall's potential for future violence and lack of genuine remorse for his actions. 2 years after the murder, Kendra's story reached national attention when a documentary filmmaker from Minneapolis approached the Holsinger family about producing a feature-length examination of the case and its implications for understanding teen dating violence in the digital age. After careful consideration and extensive discussions about how Kendra would be portrayed, the family agreed to participate, viewing the project as an opportunity to extend the educational mission of the foundation beyond local boundaries. Tracking Kendra, Love, Control, and Murder in the Digital Age premiered at the Minneapolis Film Festival in October 2022, receiving critical acclaim for its sensitive handling of the tragedy while unflinchingly examining the warning signs that had been missed and the ways technology had facilitated Randall's controlling behavior. The documentary included interviews with the Holsingers, Melissa Davis, detectives, prosecutors, and domestic violence experts, as well as carefully selected court footage that had been approved for educational use. Notably absent were any images of Randall Turpin or interviews with his family, a deliberate choice by the filmmaker to avoid glamorizing the perpetrator or causing further pain to a family already suffering the consequences of their son's actions. The film's release coincided with a growing national conversation about the role of technology in teenage relationships, particularly how apps designed for safety or convenience could be weaponized for surveillance and control. Major technology companies, responding to advocacy partially inspired by Kendra's case, began implementing enhanced privacy features and more explicit warnings about location sharing in their products. Educational resources about digital privacy and security, once primarily focused on protection from unknown predators or identity theft, expanded to include information about risks within relationships, with particular attention to how seemingly innocuous apps could be misused by controlling partners, friends, or family members. The Kendra Holsinger Foundation became a respected voice in this conversation, consulting with both tech companies and educational institutions on developing tools and curricula that balanced legitimate safety uses of technology with protections against its potential for enabling control and stalking. By the 5th anniversary of Kendra's death in June 2025, the immediate shock and grief had evolved into a more enduring legacy centered on education and prevention. The foundation had expanded its programming to include a nationally recognized training program for educators, a peer mentoring initiative for high school students, and a scholarship fund, supporting young people pursuing careers in counseling, social work, or related fields focused on relationship health and violence prevention. Jacob Holsinger, now 18 and preparing to enter college with plans to study psychology, had become an accomplished public speaker, his personal testimony about surviving the trauma of his sister's murder and finding purpose in prevention work resonating with audiences ranging from school assemblies to professional conferences. Robert and Diana, while still carrying the immeasurable grief of parents who had lost a child to violence, had found meaning in transforming their personal tragedy into a mission that had potentially saved other young lives, their work with the foundation providing both purpose and community during what might otherwise have been an unbearably isolating journey. In the North Dakota State Penitentiary, Randall Turpin's life had settled into the regulated monotony of long-term incarceration, his daily routine dictated by institutional schedules and requirements rather than the freedom and control he had once so jealously guarded. Prison records indicated mixed progress in his rehabilitation efforts, completion of required educational programs, and periodic participation in therapy, but also disciplinary incidents for fighting and contraband possession that suggested continuing struggles with impulse control and acceptance of authority. Now 21 years old, he had been transferred from the juvenile wing to the general adult population upon reaching the age of majority, a transition that had proven difficult as he navigated the complex social hierarchies and dangers of adult prison. His parents continued their monthly visits, their relationship with their son evolving into something neither fully estranged nor truly connected, a limbo of awkward conversations and unresolved emotions constrained by the artificial environment and constant supervision of the visitation room. For the town of Fargo, the murder of Kendra Holsinger had become part of the community's shared history, a tragedy that had changed how many parents approached conversations about relationships with their teenagers and how schools addressed warning signs of potentially dangerous behavior among students. The case was frequently referenced in local discussions about teen dating violence, digital privacy, and the justice system's approach to juvenile offenders, its details familiar to most residents, even as the acute shock of the event receded into memory. New students at Roosevelt High School learned about Kendra through the Memorial Garden and the Foundation's educational programs, her story becoming part of the institution's culture and identity rather than a forbidden topic or awkward silence. This integration of tragedy into community memory, neither forgetting nor remaining paralyzed by grief, represented perhaps the healthiest possible response to an event that could never be undone but might serve as a powerful catalyst for preventing similar losses in the future. The ultimate legacy of Kendra Holsinger's murder could perhaps be measured not in the punishment of Randall Turpin, significant though that was for the justice system and the family's sense of accountability, but in the number of similar tragedies that never occurred because of the awareness and education that emerged from her story. While such prevention is inherently difficult to quantify, how does one count events that don't happen? The Foundation maintained a collection of letters and testimonials from young people who had recognized warning signs in their own relationships or those of friends and taken action before control escalated to violence. These stories, shared with permission in the Foundation's materials and presentations, offered glimpses of alternative endings to situations that might otherwise have followed the same tragic trajectory as Kendra and Randall's relationship, each representing a potential life saved or irreparable harm averted. In this way, Kendra's memory continued to influence lives far beyond those who had known her personally, her story becoming not just a cautionary tale, but a catalyst for change in how young people understood and navigated the complex terrain of love, respect, control, and autonomy in their most intimate relationships. As the years passed and Randall Turpin's eventual parole hearing remained a distant point on the horizon, the broader implications of his case continued to reverberate through legal, educational, and cultural spheres. Lawmakers in several states cited the case when drafting legislation to address digital stalking and monitoring in relationships, particularly among minors, who might not be covered by traditional domestic violence statutes. Schools across the country incorporated lessons drawn from Kendra's story into their health and relationship education curricula, teaching students to recognize the difference between care and control, affection and possession, attention and surveillance. And perhaps most significantly, countless private conversations occurred between parents and children, friends and friends, partners and partners, about the boundaries of healthy relationships and the red flags that might indicate when those boundaries were being crossed. Conversations that might never have happened without the profound loss of one young woman whose life and death had inadvertently become a powerful lesson in the key dangers of possessive love and the fundamental human right to autonomy, choice, and safety in our most intimate connections.